Hi guys, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be starting something a little different. Today is going to be the first video in a series investigating that Arabic classic, the Koran. I'm Colin, and this is Colin for Books. The Koran. Like most of you, I've been planning to read this book for quite some time, and like most of you, haven't done very well in that regard. As you know, I have a theology background. I have PhD in theology. I concentrated on Catholic theology. My specialty was ancient Christian thought, so in that regard, I've studied a great deal of the many ancient religions that circled around at the time of, for instance, St. Augustine, who lived in the 4th and 5th centuries AD. St. Augustine, for instance, himself was a practitioner for a time of that religion. It really doesn't have very many adherents today, called Manichaeism. Manichaeism was a interesting combination of Platonism, Christianity, and various strains of the Greco-Roman religion. The predominant religious practice of the time was the worship of the Olympian gods, whether they went by their Roman or Greek names, and religion was predominantly a polytheistic phenomenon where the existence of many gods was recognized, and their worship was in some ways a lot of parallels with, for instance, the Catholic cult of saints, where the worship of specific gods was cultivated at certain locations and attention was drawn to them at certain times of the year. Even though Roman culture, for instance, was cosmopolitan, meaning that the empire was an amalgamation of many, many different races and types of people, worship was, in a sense, localized. There were different cults cultivated in different places in the empire, and none of them, except for Jews, were worshipped in an exclusive sense. That is to say, they denied the existence or the worthiness of other deities to be worshipped. Certain places were associated with different gods. Athens, obviously, with the worship of Athena. The city of Ephesus in Asia Minor was associated with the worship of Diana. The city of Rome was associated with the worship of Jupiter and of Juno specifically. The great city of Carthage in North Africa was associated with the worship of the Phoenician god Baal. Baal, of course, who's mentioned in the Old Testament in many, many places. Egypt, of course, recognized its gods like Isis and so on. But in all of these cases, it was a pantheon, that the legitimacy of all the specific and particular gods of each place were recognized, and there was some effort was put into coordinating them. So, for instance, in some of the writings of Plato, we see, for instance, the effort to understand or identify the Egyptian gods with the Olympian gods, to say, for instance, that the god such and such in Egypt actually corresponded to whatever god in the Greek pantheon. Religion as an exclusive thing didn't really come around until that particular strain of Judaism, called Christianity, appeared on the scene. It became the mainstream, the most important religion in the Roman Empire in the early 4th century and progressively on. And this was the first time that religion was united with citizenship, in a certain sense, is that rights and privileges were granted to people who adhered to a certain orthodoxy and was denied to those who didn't. It's a bit of exaggeration. The fact was, as we know from the fact that Christianity was persecuted and Judaism before it was persecuted by the Roman authorities, this was mainly because of its denial character. So Christianity was a problem because it would not go along with the idea that all the gods had to be accepted and the worship of all the gods had to be cultivated and encouraged. The fact was, Roman authorities thought that the strength of their empire depended upon pleasing more and more of the gods. Christianity and Judaism before it was a problem because it discouraged the worship of the gods that they had said had made Rome strong in the first place. So if the gods Jupiter and Juno were the ones who had originally made Rome strong, discouraging people from worshiping them was actually unpatriotic and in fact considered to be a kind of treason. So anyway, the fact is, to understand Christianity, as I attempted to, ancient Christianity in its context, one had to understand the setting where Christianity emerged out of. I had to study the beliefs of ancient Romans and ancient Greeks, of ancient Judaism. You had to understand the philosophy of the time, or the philosophers, Plato and Aristotle, the Stoics, and so on, and what they thought about the gods. And of course, one of the best books that indicates the kind of thinking out there in this international intellectual scene, is passed on to us by, for instance, St. Augustine's huge book, The City of God, where he attempts to defend Christianity within the context of ancient religious experience and belief. So in other words, I had to study a great deal about the ancient world to come to any great understanding of the ancient history of Christianity. And as most people know who have paid attention to movies that are based on or draw upon ancient Christianity, ancient Rome, you are aware that there were, of course, many different kinds of Christianity, even if one or a few strains came to predominate. And one of the earliest kind is generally referred to as Gnosticism. And Gnosticism is a kind of funny blend of Judaism, Christianity, and ancient Roman religions, as well as Platonic philosophy and so on. And very many of their texts have been passed on to us. For instance, the Nag Hammadi library that was discovered in Egypt has preserved very many called pseudo-Christian writings, such as, for instance, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Judas was more recently discovered or rediscovered, the Gospels of Peter, and then the different apocalypses, the apocalypses of Paul and Peter, and various pseudo-epigraphical letters and so on, as imputed to have been written by the apostles. Some of the writings have been imputed to Old Testament figures, such as Adam or Melchizedek or Seth. And of course, when you go on to study the origins of Christianity, you have to look at ancient Jewish texts as well. Not just the Old Testament, but the writings of ancient rabbis and interpreters of scripture, people like, for instance, the great Philo of Alexandria. So I've read a lot of these things and have continued to try and develop my understanding of religion in general. I've read different texts from India, and I've tried to pay attention to whatever it is that has come around. It's a big task, of course. One thing I haven't read so far is, of course, the Koran. And it seems like a huge lacuna in my formation. But the fact is, Islam and the Koran didn't affect the origins of Christianity at all, since it came in 6 centuries after Christianity began. This isn't to say, of course, that the world out of which Islam came didn't predate Christianity in some certain sense and didn't influence Christianity's development. But generally, of course, you have to look at Christianity's influence on Islam and not Islam's influence on Christianity in the initial stages. But later on, of course, both influenced each other, both positively and negatively. For instance, one of the things is that the 7th century, the Byzantine Empire, so the Eastern Greek Empire, there was controversies about icons, sacred paintings and statues of religious figures, that suddenly it became a big debate where it hadn't been in the past. One of the thoughts was that because the Eastern Christian Empire was surrounded by Islam, that Islam's prohibitions against depicting in graphic form divine figures, that this influenced certain Christians, who in turn put pressure on the Greek churches to also prohibit the veneration of icons. So in other words, I'm coming at this study as a student, as someone curious, as someone who has read and continues to desire to read widely. My personal interest, of course, is in man's religious wanderings. I read so widely in part because I'm curious about how people conceive of human life, how they give meaning to their own lives in the face of the question of why is there something rather than nothing? Does life have a meaning? Is history oriented to some point of termination? Can man be happy? Can man find meaning with God today in this modern world? Can he find meaning in this modern world without God? Are all people equally open to experiences of divine or supernatural things? And what are the impacts of the various creeds of human beings, whether Christian or Muslim or Hindu? What impact do these things have upon human nature, upon human goodness, upon social development? All these questions are key ones. What's the relationship between morality and religion? Can you be moral without religion? And what ought to be, or what can be, the relationship between reason or science and religion? All of these things are questions that deeply interest me. About 2 years ago, I think it was, I did a book review of a book on the history of the formation of Islam, and it was extremely popular, much more popular than any of my other book reviews. So I thought, to kill two birds with one stone, both to force me to read the Koran and also to gain some interest from YouTube viewers, I thought I would prepare this series of discussions of the Koran. I'm not coming at the book with any special knowledge. I don't have any knowledge of the Arabic language. I don't have special knowledge of the history and of the sects of the Islamic religion. I don't have any close acquaintance with any Muslims. But I think that it will be of interest to people anyway for me to share my impressions of this text. I know a great deal about the history of the Western world. I don't know a great deal of the history of any other civilization. So this is my starting point, and I've stated already my interest. Your interest won't be the same necessarily, but I think the interest of Westerners in Islam has been growing quite steadily since 9/11, of course, and all the terror attacks that have been happening since then, and of course before then as well. So in considering how to best present my impressions of the Quran is divided up into, at least the version that I'm studying, which is the Penguin Classics presentation of the Quran. It's divided into 114 sections. I'm going to call them sections because I don't know what their technical word is. And this version is about 435 or so pages long. I think what I'll do is divide it up into about maybe 5 or 6 different sections so that I'm dealing with perhaps a bit less than 100 pages of the Quran per video. That's my guess about how to best do this. Maybe it'll turn out well, maybe it won't, but hey, it doesn't hurt to try. So over the next little while, I'll be presenting videos broken up over these chapters or sections of the Quran. And I hope you will come along with me and listen to my interpretations, or sorry, not my interpretations, but my impressions of this very important work, this classic of Arab culture.